Chicago, Illinois. The Berto Center. November 1995. The practice facility sat 12 miles north of the United Center, tucked away from the city noise in a converted industrial building that the Chicago Bulls had transformed into one of the most advanced training complexes in professional basketball. Its floors were hardwood, its lighting was controlled, and its walls had absorbed more competitive energy than most arenas ever would. This was not a place for spectators. This was a place for work. Serious, concentrated, private work. The kind that happened before the cameras arrived, before the crowds filled the seats, before the world saw what all of it produced. On a Tuesday morning in early November, 2 weeks before the 1995-96 season would officially begin, 42 players, coaches, and staff members were gathered at the Berto Center for a practice session that would be remembered for the rest of the decade. Not because of what was planned, because of what was not planned at all. Michael Jordan had returned to the Bulls the previous March after 18 months away. His return had been everything the basketball world hoped it would be, and simultaneously more complicated than anyone had expected. The team was different. The roster had evolved in his absence. New personnel, new dynamics, new personalities filling the space that his departure had left not just on the floor, but in the culture of the franchise. Jordan was back. But the question hanging over the entire organization was whether the team that surrounded him was capable of doing what his previous iterations had already done 3 times. Win it all. To answer that question, in the summer of 1995, the Bulls made a decision that shocked the entire league. They traded Will Perdue to the San Antonio Spurs for Dennis Rodman. The reaction was immediate and divided. Half the basketball world called it genius. The other half called it organizational suicide. Dennis Rodman was, in 1995, the most talented rebounder in the history of professional basketball, and simultaneously the most combustible personality the sport had ever produced. He had won back-to-back championships with the Detroit Pistons. He had won 2 more with the San Antonio Spurs. He had been suspended, fined, ejected, and featured in more controversy than most players accumulate in an entire career. He was a force of nature wrapped in tattoos and rainbow-colored hair who operated by rules that he had written himself and revised whenever he felt like it. He was also, by any objective measure, exactly what the Chicago Bulls needed to win a championship. Michael Jordan knew this. Phil Jackson knew this. The front office knew this. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it in person are 2 profoundly different things. And the experience of Dennis Rodman in a practice setting was something that could not be fully understood until it had been lived. For the first 2 weeks of training camp, things were managed carefully. Phil Jackson, a man with a doctorate in human psychology disguised as a basketball coach, had structured the environment deliberately. He had created space for Rodman's eccentricities without allowing them to become disruptions. He had given Jordan and Rodman time to observe each other, to develop a working understanding of the other's rhythms and needs before placing them in direct competitive situations. That careful management ended on the Tuesday morning in November. The drill was called 5-on-5 blockout. The concept was simple. The offensive team shot freely. The defensive team was responsible for establishing position, making contact, and securing every rebound. Points went to the defensive team for each rebound secured, to the offensive team for every second chance opportunity created. It was a drill designed to build the physical habits of positioning, to make the war for space under the basket automatic and instinctive. Phil Jackson divided the team. Jordan went to the offensive side. Rodman went to the defensive side. Nobody said anything about what that meant, but everyone in the building understood it immediately. Michael Jordan, in 1995, was possessed by something that his first championship run had not fully revealed. The 18-month absence had done something to him psychologically that went far beyond what most people analyzed from the outside. He had come back from baseball not just as a basketball player returning to his sport, but as a man with a score to settle, with the game, with the doubters, with time itself. He had failed to win the championship in his first season back. The Orlando Magic had eliminated the Bulls in the second round, and Horace Grant, a man Jordan had played alongside for years, had celebrated that elimination with a visible enthusiasm that Jordan had cataloged and filed away. He had spent the summer of 1995 reconstructing himself physically and psychologically for a season that he had decided would not end the same way. Dennis Rodman, standing at the free throw line as Phil Jackson explained the drill parameters, was not thinking about any of that. Rodman did not think about layers and narratives and psychological motivations. He thought about the floor, the ball, and the space between him and it. He had rebounded against every size, every power, every speed the league had produced in his 12 professional seasons. He had developed a system that was less about athleticism and more about geometry, about reading the trajectory of a missed shot before anyone else had even begun to process it, about positioning his body in the exact location where the ball was going to arrive. He was not the fastest player in the building. He was not the strongest. He was the most precise. And precision, in the art of rebounding, was everything. The drill began. For the first several possessions, Jordan tested the perimeter. He moved, received passes, shot from mid-range, watched how the defensive rotations developed. This was habitual for him. He was reading, cataloging, building the mental map of what the defense was doing before he began to dismantle it. Scottie Pippen, on the offensive side with Jordan, worked the baseline and the post. The possessions went back and forth. Points accumulated on both sides. The energy was competitive but controlled. Then Jordan, on a pull-up jumper from the elbow, missed. The ball hit the back of the rim with a sound that every player in the gym recognized as a long rebound. It was going to come off hard and high and toward the opposite elbow. Jordan moved before anyone else. He was inside the paint in 2 steps, his positioning precise, his body already angled for the catch. Whatever the drill was supposed to be in those seconds, what Jordan was actually doing was signaling something. He was signaling that even in a practice drill, even with no points on the board that mattered in any real sense, he moved as if his survival depended on it. He moved as if the distance between him and that basketball was the only distance in the world that had any meaning. He got to the spot. He rose. And Dennis Rodman was already there. Not arriving. Already there. Already stationary. Already positioned. Already with his lower body locked into the floor like a piling driven into concrete. He had read the trajectory before the ball left Jordan's hand. He had moved not to the spot where the ball was going to come down, but to the position that gave him the optimal angle to receive it and simultaneously deny Jordan access to the same space. He was not blocking Jordan out in the conventional sense of the term, the physical contact drill where a defender puts his back against an offensive player and pushes. He had simply arrived first and made Jordan's position irrelevant by occupying the only space that mattered. Jordan tried to go through him, planted his left shoulder, drove his weight forward, the same move he had used to create space against defenders for 11 professional seasons. It was a move that had worked against everyone. Against power forwards who outweighed him by 60 pounds, against centers who had 2 inches of height and leverage on him, against defensive specialists whose entire professional purpose was stopping exactly this kind of movement. Rodman did not move. Not an inch. It was not that he absorbed the contact and held his ground through effort. It was that the contact seemed to encounter something that could not be moved the way physical force is supposed to move things. His feet were in the exact right position. His hips were low, his center of gravity planted below Jordan's center of gravity, which meant that Jordan's force was pushing not against a vertical wall, but against something that was angled and rooted in a way that redirected the energy rather than resisting it. Rodman had spent 15 years studying how to make his body unmovable, not through size, but through geometry. Jordan hit that geometry at full force and found nothing to move. The ball came down. Rodman caught it with both hands. He held it for exactly 1 second, turning it in his hands the way someone might examine an object they've handled so many times it has become an extension of themselves. Then he passed it out to Tony Kukoc and loped back to the defensive position without saying a word. Jordan landed from his jump and stood completely still for a moment. The gym was not silent exactly. Sneakers still squeaked. Coaches still called adjustments. The background noise of a professional practice continued. But within the specific radius of where Jordan was standing, something had shifted. The players closest to him could sense it, the way you can sense a change in atmospheric pressure sometimes before you can articulate what's different about the air. He had thrown his full physical force at Dennis Rodman and found nothing there to move. 3 possessions later, Jordan received the ball at the top of the key. He drove left, drew the defense, and kicked it to Pippen cutting baseline, who scored easily. Jordan almost didn't watch the basket go in. He was watching Rodman set up for the next defensive possession, studying his footwork, his angles, the way he planted before contact arrived rather than in response to it. Then, on the next possession, something changed. Jordan received the ball in the post, 15 feet from the basket. He pump-faked once, drawing no reaction from Rodman, who had seen the move catalog of the entire league and did not blink at textbook pump fakes. Jordan went up for the jumper. Missed again. Another long rebound, different angle this time. coming off toward the right baseline. Jordan did not go to the ball. He went to Rodman. 3 steps, perfectly timed, arriving at Rodman's right side at the exact moment Rodman was beginning to rotate toward the flight path of the ball. Instead of going through Rodman's front, Jordan went to his side, planting his hip against Rodman's hip, using not forward force but lateral redirection, trying to move Rodman's established position horizontally rather than through it. Rodman adjusted in a single motion. His right foot slid 18 inches. His hip turned. His entire base had already compensated for the lateral pressure before Jordan had finished applying it. The adjustment was not dramatic or visible to anyone more than 5 feet away. It was compact, precise, and complete. Rodman's position was restored. His angle to the ball was intact. He caught the rebound again. This time, before he passed it out, he looked at Jordan. Just for a moment, and he said something that everyone within earshot heard clearly, and none of them would forget. "You don't go through me, Michael. Nobody goes through me." The words were not aggressive. They were not trash talk in the traditional sense of the phrase. They were said with the flat, factual confidence of someone describing the rules of gravity. Matter of fact, certain. The way a craftsman might explain to an apprentice something that has been true for as long as the craftsman can remember. Jordan looked at him. His expression was unreadable in the way his expression during competition was always unreadable, which was to say it gave away nothing while simultaneously communicating everything to anyone who knew how to read it. He said nothing. He turned and jogged back to the offensive position. Phil Jackson watched from the sideline. He did not intervene. He had built his entire coaching philosophy on the understanding that certain lessons could only be learned through direct experience, and certain competitive fires could only be tested by someone capable of actually testing them. He had brought Rodman here precisely because he believed Rodman was the only person on this roster capable of making Michael Jordan feel what Jordan was feeling in this moment. Not intimidated. Michael Jordan was incapable of intimidation, but aware, forced into awareness of a problem that his existing solutions could not solve. What happened over the next 11 minutes of that drill was something that Phil Jackson, Scottie Pippen, and every coach and player present that morning would describe differently to different people at different points in their lives, but would always describe as something they had never seen before. Michael Jordan changed. Not his effort. His effort was always at its maximum, not his intensity. These were constants, as fixed as the hardwood floor. What changed was his method. He stopped trying to go through Rodman and began trying to go around the system that Rodman had constructed. He started using angles he had never needed against anyone else, positioning his body in a lower stance than was natural for him, trying to get his center of gravity below Rodman's center of gravity the way Rodman got below everyone else. He began reading the floor before the shot went up instead of reacting to it afterward. He started studying Rodman's footwork during dead balls, between possessions, in the way he had studied game film for years, cataloging and processing and building a counter system in real time. After 3 possessions of this adjusted approach, Jordan got a rebound over Rodman. 1. Rodman said nothing, gave nothing away, kept moving. But Jordan said something, not loudly, not to the room, almost quietly, and almost to himself, though Pippen standing 6 feet away heard it clearly. There it is. 2 words. Said not with celebration, but with the cold recognition of a man who has located what he was looking for after a long search. The satisfaction not of victory, but of orientation. He had found the answer to a puzzle that had been unsolvable through his usual approach, and he had found it through 11 minutes of systematic adjustment and failure and continuous recalibration. After practice, in the film room, Phil Jackson addressed what had happened during the drill. He did not dramatize it, did not turn it into a speech. He said simply that what the team had seen on the floor that morning was a preview of something, and that the best teams in NBA history had not been best because they had the most individual talent. They had been best because their talent had developed the capacity to challenge each other in private and make each other better in ways that only showed up publicly when it mattered most. Rodman sat in the back of the film room with his arms crossed, his eyes half closed, apparently on the edge of sleep. But anyone who knew Dennis Rodman understood that this was how he processed things. His body went still so that his mind could move. Jordan sat in the second row. He was watching the game film already playing on the screen. Nobody who looked at him could have known that 2 hours earlier he had encountered something he couldn't immediately solve. He had the same expression he always had in film rooms, focused forward, thinking forward, the past already incorporated and filed and done. The 1995-96 Chicago Bulls finished the regular season with 72 wins. They won the championship. The three pieces of that machine, Jordan, Pippen, and Rodman, functioned in a way that looked, from the outside, almost inevitable, almost preordained into history. But it had not been inevitable on that November morning at the Berto Center. It had been uncertain the way all great things are uncertain at their beginning, full of tension and unanswered questions, and the genuine possibility of failure. The alignment of those three personalities into something coherent had required each of them to encounter something they couldn't immediately overcome and choose to adapt rather than retreat. Rodman had told Michael Jordan that nobody goes through him, and Jordan had taken 11 minutes, had failed repeatedly, had adjusted his entire physical and mental approach, and had found the one answer that worked. Not because anyone handed it to him, because the problem was real, and the solution required being real in return. Years later, when journalists asked Jordan about the 1995-96 team in the context of greatest teams in NBA history, he would talk about the system, about Phil Jackson, about Pippen, about the collective identity of that roster, but in quieter conversations, in interviews where the question was specific enough, he said something that he repeated in slightly different form more than once. Rodman made me better at something I thought I already knew how to do. That's the rarest thing that can happen to you at that level. Somebody showing you a part of your own game that you thought was finished being built. And occasionally, when the interviewer pushed further and asked what specifically Rodman had shown him, Jordan paused, and then said simply, "He showed me that size is not a wall, and walls are not always what they look like. Sometimes the unmovable thing teaches you more than the thing that moves." Somewhere in the back of whatever room he was in when those interviews played back to him through a screen, Dennis Rodman was probably watching something else entirely, or thinking about something completely unrelated. He did not spend time curating his legacy with words. He spent time doing the thing, and the thing was always the same thing: position, angles, geometry, the ball coming off the rim and the space between him and everything else that wanted it. Nobody goes through me. He had not been trash-talking. He had been stating a principle. And the greatest basketball player who ever lived had spent 11 minutes in a practice gym learning why that principle was true, and come out the other side a better player for it. That is not a story about limits. That is a story about what happens when two kinds of mastery, the mastery of individual brilliance and the mastery of a single specialized craft, meet with full force and full honesty, and neither one surrenders to the other. Both men walked out of the Berto Center that Tuesday morning changed. Neither would have described it that way, but the 72-win season that followed said it clearly enough for anyone paying attention.